Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Women Warrior Sessions. I'm Melanie Tykro. I'm super excited for this week's session. We have special guest Kelly Price with us. Kelly's a certified yoga instructor, and she's a yoga facilitator trained in trauma recovery specifically. It's a really great conversation. It's very timely. So the WHO has actually realized that there's a shadow pandemic right now going on of violence against women and children domestically. We need to be talking about this in our communities. And what's really lovely about this conversation is Kelly reminds us that there's a strength that comes from trauma recovery work, but there's also a real gentleness that's required to bring you back home to yourself in this work. I enjoyed this conversation so much because we talk a lot about trauma within a larger social justice framework. Thank you again for following me here on YouTube. Follow, like, share Melanie Tykrop. I'm going to keep talking, having these conversations with women warriors, because there's a lot of really great work going on. And I'm just deeply honored that all of these amazing women are sitting down and talking with me so that we can share and open up a broader conversation. So without further ado, here's Kelly Price and our talk on trauma. I would just like to start our warrior women's session, our women warrior session, by acknowledging that we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Snuneymuxw, and how grateful we are to be here, and that we acknowledge all of the experiences of all of the individuals who've come before us on this land. We are so lucky to have our special guest Kelly Price here. Okay, so let's get started here. Let's dive right in. And the first thing I need to ask you is, what is trauma?
Yes, so the big question, and I just want to give a little bit of context to this. Trauma is such a large topic,
Yes.
and also the term I think is really used with a lot of variation nowadays. So obviously, with our time frame today, just focusing in on my own experience of working with trauma, my own understanding of what trauma is. And really, what I'm doing is looking at it through the lens of the nervous system and the brain, in particular, as a yoga therapist, working with it in that way. And also looking at attachment. So, looking at relational trauma in particular.
Yeah.
So, just to say that it's, there's a wide spectrum of how we're looking at trauma, everything from a single incident shock trauma and the impact that that can have on our nervous system and our brain, and also looking at experiences of trauma that are different than that, that are more relational and longitudinal, which I think is really relevant to our conversation today, around childhood trauma and around women's experience of trauma, violence against women. So there's sort of some distinctions that we can make within that larger category. And of course, you mentioned PTSD. That's sort of our the interesting thing for me about that is that's the one official diagnosis that we have, that we can look at trauma through. If we talk about it from um, the perspective of the psychiatric or the medical model, that is the only official diagnosis and criteria that we have for trauma. So there's actually a lot of experiences outside of that diagnosis and that sort of strict categorization that sort of don't really have anywhere to fall officially in terms of how they're validated or how they're seen, which I think is also really relevant to our conversation around how this impacts women and children in particular. So,
Well, and the first thought that comes up from that is a lot of the research is done around a lot of scientific and medical research is done with a bias towards male subjects.
Exactly.
And so, when we talk about trauma and PTSD, perhaps a lot of that is seen through the lens of the male experience of this.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah, that's a
yeah,
good it's a good starting place, I think, particularly to understand that PTSD initially came out of research with male veterans. And so it came out of the context of their experience of war. And so that the legacy of that is still with us in terms of, again, not taking into consideration the experiences of women. And, although there's been some progress, it's still a very limited understanding that we're working with. For example, if we don't like you have to meet all the criteria for PTSD to receive that diagnosis. And if you don't, where do you land? Right. Which I can say has been my experience. It's sort of outside the realm of, again, what is validated. So but just to say also, like, if we think of the experience of trauma really as the core experience of it as the experience of helplessness and disconnection,
mhm,
and sort of that sense that, the experience has been overwhelming in terms of our ability to cope and respond, and leaves us with a feeling of helplessness and sometimes hopelessness as well.
yeah.
So, yeah.
And so, to that point, how is trauma typically treated for women? Let's just dive into the specifics then.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when we look at, maybe some of our listeners are familiar with um, the sort of moniker, I don't know if that's the right word, but CPTSD.
Oh,
So
haven't
what's
heard of
termed
that.
complex trauma.
Okay.
So there's been several attempts to actually introduce and expand the criteria for our understanding of trauma within. So we're talking about the DSM, the Diagnostical Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is kind of the official Bible on conditions.
Right.
So there's been attempts to research and categorize these other experiences of trauma, which are relational. If we're looking at, say, a child in a situation that they can't escape from, there's a prolonged experience of helplessness, a prolonged experience of yeah, powerlessness, right?
Yeah.
And how we have to adapt to that in order to survive. Similarly, for women in domestic violence and violence against women, that sense of captivity.
Yeah.
So CPTSD and the research around that is attempting to explore what those subtleties are that aren't validated, that aren't categorized within PTSD. So how to, when trauma happens at a particular developmental stage, that's a factor that can influence the outcome for an
Right.
individual. And that sense of captivity, right? That sense of not being able to escape. For example, women being financially dependent and not able to step outside of their circumstances and having to adapt and survive. Um, that's a different experience of trauma than, say, a shock trauma like a single incident
Right.
event, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. And
Yeah.
something I was reading preparing for this, but you and I have talked about this before as well, is that two people can experience the same event,
Yeah.
um, and one person may not experience it as trauma,
Yeah.
and another person might. And
Yes.
so, um, you were talking about validation earlier, and
Mhm.
in terms of treatment, um, how how are women's experiences validated in treatment?
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll speak from a personal perspective and also from, sort of the anonymous perspective of women that I've worked with over the years. I think it's a real issue. I think that when our experiences aren't validated from that official perspective, when we sort of fall through the cracks, there's the sense of invalidation. um, and also to say that there's a history of this within how women are treated within psychotherapy and psychiatry. When we look at the history of, say, hysteria, for example, female hysteria, there's sort of this underlying current of invalidation of our experience, our emotional experience, our sexual experience, our um, how we're impacted body, mind, and spirit by trauma.
Yeah.
So it just,
Do you find that women struggle a bit coming to you to work on trauma, perhaps because they've been invalidated previously and that maybe compounds their trauma in some way?
absolutely, yeah. Well, I think there's always so much that I would like to say about that, but I think, yeah, it definitely, I think compounds is a good word.
Yeah.
Um, Again, my own experience has been to really have to seek my own answers and to seek allies who also perhaps have similar experience. To seek out those folks. Judith Herman is someone who I follow, who I've researched and studied, and she was a pioneer in terms of understanding the female experience of trauma. And that term complex trauma or CPTSD is related to her work. And again, she's someone who pioneered and worked very hard for many, many years, and it's still not officially been adopted, right? So I think we're in this interesting place with the female experience of trauma, children's experience of trauma, where there is a lack of validation. And how can we create a culture um, within within circles of women where we start to validate these experiences for ourselves, and based on the research. Like, it's not it there is research to back up these experiences,
Right.
even though it hasn't been adopted.
Yeah.
This interpersonal trauma that we're talking about, and it sort of, I see it as connected to larger systems of oppression,
Mm.
in terms of, that's really, I think, sort of the sort of, I'm not sure what word to use, but the bias that we're up against. It is because an acknowledgement of interpersonal trauma fans out from there into an understanding of these larger systems of oppression and misuse of power. um, that's really what we're talking about. Systems like patriarchy and white supremacy are
Yeah.
not disconnected from interpersonal trauma, individual trauma, if that makes sense.
Makes a
So,
lot of sense.
yeah.
How do you specifically work with women
Mhm.
to begin this healing journey of trauma recovery?
Yeah. So, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I think, if we think about the core experience of trauma as helplessness and disconnection, then really the healing is about empowerment and reconnection, right?
Okay.
And I think that the way that if I can sort of put it in a nutshell, the way that I approach that from my own work is a sense of how do we experience safety in relationship to our own body and breath. So there's that reconnection to ourselves, our somatic selves, which, our body holds all of our experience. So we're reconnecting to the truth that's held here.
Mhm.
And then also, how do we foster what I'm going to call secure attachment? So being able to foster relationships in our lives where we are able to be authentic, and still be connected with others. So, um, if we think about interpersonal trauma as being, uh, maybe a place where we've experienced having to sacrifice who we actually are, our needs, our safety, in order to survive, part of the reclamation and the healing is, um, finding, and I'm not underestimating the challenge of this sometimes, finding and fostering relationships where we can heal, those wounds where we've disconnected from ourselves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's lovely. And I I'm thinking about the sort of the collective women we, um in the sense of the women warrior
Yeah.
tribe. And when people have trauma,
Mhm.
they respond from a place of trauma. So if you're working towards recovery and you're looking to find those people with whom you can have those interpersonal connections and find that closeness again with, is it hard for women to find that with other women because women have been hurt?
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think this is a really interesting topic. I think, one of the things I needed to sort out in my own journey was that I experienced trauma and patriarchy through the female relationships in my family. And so initially, I had to sort that out for myself in terms of patriarchy can act through women as
Yes.
well as men,
Yeah.
right? And as you said, men have experience of trauma through patriarchy as well,
Right.
right? And we
Absolutely.
that's a big topic as well. So, um yeah, I think healing relationships between women, I think we're really, actually set up to, be in conflict with each other, to be disconnected from each other. So part of the healing actually is healing those wounds, um, in relationship. And yeah, it's not easy to find, at least it hasn't been in my experience, to find those spaces where that can happen, where there's accountability and the priority is on safety. For me, I've had to prioritize that and to validate my own need for that. Um, and also, when I've found it, it's like gold.
Yeah.
It's so precious in terms of the quantum. I'm going to use that word, quantum healing that can happen.
Yeah.
Judith Herman says, trauma, interpersonal trauma occurs in relationship and it's healed in relationship. So we actually need to engage, relationship in order to heal those interpersonal traumas. So yeah, it's yeah, yeah, so much that I could say about that, but I hope that's helpful.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. And so to move forward on those points that you made,
Mhm.
how is how is trauma recovery important for inner strength and healing?
Yeah, so mm, thinking about, I think, inner strength and healing, one of the things I often picture a bowl, when I'm working with, resourcing myself. And I know you mentioned mindfulness earlier. um, I picture a bowl that has been that the sort of that Japanese art of filling in the cracks of a broken vessel with gold. And I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough, we talk about people being broken because of trauma. I
Right.
know I've been there myself, feeling that and feeling the weight of that. But what we don't talk about enough sometimes is what's possible through the healing of trauma
Yes.
and the sense of deep connection to ourselves and to life and to others. Um, so yeah, I think of that metaphor of, the cracks become healed and actually become this beautiful thing that we then can move from in our lives. That's been my experience, I think, in terms of um, yeah, validating, like making a priority of validating my experience, and then being able to stand in that and being able to move from that, if that makes sense. um,
Absolutely.
yeah,
And
so
I love you using the comparison of the vein of gold. Like,
mhm,
I've never heard anyone describe trauma recovery that way, and it's so beautiful because it's almost like I'm not going to, well, and everyone's journey is different, but in this analogy, it's like I'm not going to hide or cover up this part of my reality.
yes,
I'm just it's part of who I am. It's part of this vessel, and
yeah,
yeah, I just think that's so beautiful. I think you're
mhm.
right. I don't think that part of the trauma recovery process is talked about enough. Maybe because, and maybe I can get you to speak on this, maybe because trauma recovery work is hard work.
Yes, and that I always feel a little bit of a maybe a pinch around it. I think maybe that's again because we don't talk about post traumatic growth enough,
Yes,
but it's not meant as a way of denying the challenge of healing. I think actually, um another metaphor I think about is a chrysalis and what it requires to actually go through an internal transformation and then emerge in a different form. I
yeah,
mean, we have these beautiful metaphors from nature. And yeah, so each of us, in terms of our internal transformation, like you said, it looks different for each of us. And I think that's part of what's fascinating and also really challenging is sometimes, we're really in reconnecting with ourselves. No one can really tell us what the right answer is or what the next move is, or but we don't have to do it alone at the same time. We can be in
correct.
connection as we're doing that.
Yes,
um, and that's part of what I appreciate about these kinds of spaces that you're creating. We need to have that larger connection and be able to go inward at the same time in order to, and just to say, this is one of the key things that I focus on in my work is that, you know, people can be very well intentioned, therapists, spouse, friends, all of these relationships in our lives. And the healing of trauma comes from us being able to practice choice and agency if someone is trying to offer us something that they think is useful, that's not as important as us discovering what is useful for ourselves, if that
yes.
makes sense.
Oh, yeah,
That's the key right there.
yeah.
So I'm giving you the gold there
I
in
know.
terms of
I
what
like.
I've learned about that. And
Thank you.
so that's something I come back to again and again.
Yeah, very, very empowering.
Oh,
And
my
I'm just
pleasure.
so grateful for your time with us today. You're a real gift to our community,
Mm,
and we're so honored to have you talk with us about trauma and inner strength today. Thank you
thanks,
so
Ellen.
much.
Thank you.